Welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Buino, and I'm so excited to be sharing today's interview with you. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. Please join us starting in November for our online NARM Basics training to learn how to transform trauma. This online NARM Basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it is essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. NARM provides a relational approach to addressing the current COVID pandemic and tools to support healing in the aftermath of this collective trauma. If you're looking for more advanced training in complex trauma and are working in mental health, healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/online basics. Now let me introduce you to today's guest. Cassandra, or Cassie Walker, is a Black, queer, licensed clinical social worker, therapist, activist, and aspiring speaker and podcaster. They are working towards their master-level NARM certification and are also certified in hypnotherapy and NLP. They present a diverse array of intersectional topics related to race, gender, sexuality, BDSM and kink, mental health, and social justice. Cassie provides therapy to adults, relationships, and groups. They specialize in the intersections of trauma, identity, and mental wellness. Their podcast, Woke Mental Wellness, works to help provide information about mental wellness to Black LGBTQIA+ people and those interested in helping Black queer communities. Cassie has also started their own business, Intersection Center for Complex Healing, LLC, with the hope to one day be a full-on Black queer wellness center, COVID permitting, of course. In their therapy work, Cassie takes an anti-oppressive, anti-racist, trauma-informed, relational approach to discussing identity, trauma, mental wellness, and social justice to address how the legacies of slavery and other atrocities continue to ripple into current events and experiences. From the levels of societal institutions to our internal experiences, Cassie recognizes that we will engage in our survival styles, getting stuck in and perpetuating cycles of oppression and pain, unless we work to change and embrace compassion, accountability, and authenticity. Through providing therapy, educating, and facilitating, Cassie hopes to help people open themselves and their organizations to change that improve personal awareness and institutional inclusion. So please enjoy my conversation with the wonderful Cassie Walker. Hello, Cassie. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Hey, Sarah.
How's it going?
It's going.
Right? We're alive. We're here.
Yeah, we're alive for now. We're here for now. And if we're really, really lucky, maybe the world will stop imploding.
Maybe, right?
Yes.
Well, I really appreciate being able to chat with you here. And just so listeners know, Cassie and I are quite familiar with each other. We are NARM buddies within our Chicago cohort. So we're quite familiar and enjoy each other's company.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
It's amazing to have friends in NARM.
I know, right? Well, the way we like to start this podcast is by asking what it is that you really want listeners to get out of the episode today.
Yeah, I think today I want listeners to get out that NARM and mental health in general is not just for white people. And I really want people to get out of this something that they can use to really look at how they're relating to their spirituality, whatever they consider that to be or not be.
Wonderful. Well, let's crack into it. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes. So I am a Black queer therapist here in Chicago. I do some other stuff as well, but doing therapy, I am launching my business, Intersection Center for Complex Healing.
I love that name.
Thank you. Yeah, because we are focusing on the intersections of trauma, identity, and mental wellness. And so it's going to be It's going to be super great, and it's going to really give me the ability to fully relaunch my podcast, which is Woke Mental Wellness. And that's the platform that I use to help folks really start to get information about how, as Black queer people, we can understand ourselves and understand how these systems work and how we can really actually work these systems to get our healing, because there is a lot of investment in not allowing people of various identities that have been oppressed to get their healing, because being wounded tends to yield a lot of capital in capitalist society.
Right, right. Well, that may be a really great place to start, because with the murder of George Floyd and the protests and the eruption that's happened, and a lot of white people finally kind of waking up to Black Lives Matter and being invested in this, the conversation that I continue to see on therapist Facebook groups and that we're all having is, how do we talk about this in the therapy space? And the whole white therapists have thought forever that we were remaining neutral by not bringing it into the room. And we've recognized finally now that that's actually been harming people. So I'm sure you have tons of thoughts about the trauma that's been caused by the psychology industry.
Well, new podcast. It's called Cassie Goes Off. It's called Cassie Indulges Their Trauma Strategies.
Yeah, right.
Their survival strategies. Because I think that's something that's really hard, is because you have, when we talk, and I want to go ahead and start out by acknowledging the fact that I am going to be focusing really heavily on Blackness in this conversation, because that's where I'm coming at, that's where we're at. And I will also say that the majority of what we're about to talk about is very easily translatable to Indigenous folks, non-Black Indigenous folks of all sorts, and many other various people of color who have had their identities stolen throughout history. Because that's the biggest thing here, right? Is when non-Black therapists talk about how to show up in the room and well, if we just don't talk about it, we're remaining neutral. Well, silence is violence.
Right.
That silence, that not talking about the fact that we as Black people don't get a history, we don't get a narrative that is at all flattering. We don't get those things unless you're either very lucky or growing up now and are also still fairly lucky. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, I am increasingly starting to believe that without knowing the history, without knowing the violence, without knowing the multifaceted nature of sitting in a mental health setting with a Black person as a white person, and even as a Black person or as a Latinx person, those dynamics, if you don't know it, you're really walking into a giant minefield that is packed with potential to harm. And I think that's going to sound really strong to a lot of people. And I'm going to be really honest at this point, I don't care, because people are dying. Right. Black people are 10% more likely to have distress when it comes to mental health, and yet are one of the least likely demographics to get help. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's because, white therapists are oh yeah, no, I can see anybody. I'm woke. I'm super into it. I've read Audre Lorde. And it's but did you? Did you really? Because there's a lot of quotes, people love to put MLK in their mouth and use it as a form of perpetuating disconnection from Black people to their history.
Ooh, let that breathe a little bit. Yeah, that just felt really powerful.
That's what I wanted to talk about today, is that so much of these histories and so much of who we were, who we could have been, who we are, is used to further disconnect, to further objectify people, that if you're not acutely aware of it and speaking on it, more than likely you're propagating it. I see a white therapist, and I've seen white therapists because I could not find a Black therapist. And now I have a very high bar for what I want in a therapist. And all the Black folks that do it are my friends.
Right. So that's the problem. The longer you're in this field, the more you know everyone, and they can't therapize you anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, even my therapist and I have to have conversations about like where we're going to be and how that's going to work, because we occupy the same spaces. And I think that that's something that we lose in this field and have lost through bowing to white supremacy, oppression, professionalization in ways that don't necessarily need to be there. Like, I am a firm, very strong believer in boundaries, but there's a difference between boundary and disconnecting yourself from those that you serve.
Yes.
When we talk about this, like, I have white colleagues who have been like, yeah, no, if I saw my client at the gym, I'd switch gyms. And I'm like, if you saw your client at the gym,
right,
dude, I'm sitting over here being like, hey, as long as you don't watch me play in the dungeon, I'm kinky. So like, this is, but I'm sitting here negotiating, like, we're gonna be in the same spaces sometimes, and like, what's the level where this no longer works? And like, I've had to fine tune that because I, one, don't want to be disconnected from the people that I'm serving. Like, one of the things I really like about NARM is the fact that there's this massive focus on connection and interconnectedness as something that can be healthy. That's not just, oh, you're codependent.
Right.
That actually recognizes the fact that we as humans, whether you're atheist or whether you are the most devout Orthodox, whatever, that we share a certain connectivity when we're at our best. So I don't want to be shuddering in my boots that, oh my God, what if my client is my cashier at the checkout? Like,
right.
We're all people. The fact that that's a problem for people, the fact that people that I'll see in our therapist groups that are like, oh my God, my client just moved down the street. What do I do?
I have 2 clients that live on either side. And it's not fun, but it's negotiable.
Yeah. And now, granted, I don't want, like, I'm not saying, go hang out with your clients. Like, no, you need some veil there. They need to be able to come to you and say things and not be like, oh, damn, I intimately know this thing, and this thing about you.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, that relatability is important. And it's something that white psychology has really shunned. Like, the blank slate has long been the pinnacle of the most professional therapists. And I like that NARM breaks that away. I like the fact that we're not trying to sit here and act like we're not humans too. Like, we don't get affected, because that's a barrier to care.
Yes.
For Black people. Research has shown it. And of course, we're not all monoliths. There are plenty of folks who I'm sure love blank slate therapists, and more power to them, because there's plenty.
Right.
But at the end of the day, what the research shows is like, we want to connect. We want to feel like, yeah, you're my therapist, and also like, I know you're a person. I'm spilling the beans, something that we've been trained not to do, right? You don't put your business out in the street. You keep it in the family. You keep it in the church. You keep it in these places. And to then add on to what's already a bunch of internalized stigma and shame and things that are walking into the room when someone comes in and admits that they need help as a Black person, probably walking into a room with a non-Black therapist, because if you're Black and you want to be a therapist, please do it, because there's not enough of us.
Right.
Then we just end up immediately from the get-go colluding with the shame and self-hatred that is part of, at least every Black person in America that I've ever met. Like, part of what prompted this episode was I listened to the episode with you and Dr. Heller talking about spirituality, and I was in my kitchen, I was making food, and I was screaming.
What did we screw up? Tell me, bring it.
Because you're talking about the interconnectedness, and there was mention of some brief like Buddhism and things, but there was no mention of Black spirituality and Blackness, and like that is so much a thing that you can't really find books on Black mental health that don't talk about spirituality. Now, they're
interesting,
very much typically in the realm of the Christian church, which I have feelings about. I was semi-raised in the church. It's an interesting story for another time, but I went through the heavily Christian phase, and what's really interesting is Black people, the theory, when you look into psychotherapy, when you look at Afrocentricity, when you look at Black philosophy, African philosophy, it's all rooted in the fact that we're interconnected, and that part of our authenticity and part of our liveness comes from being able to relate. And so I'm just like, why are you not talking about Black people here?
Right.
Like,
well, let's talk about the white institution schools that, I didn't learn it. And of course, like, it's on me to go seek it out, but it's not there.
No one learns it unless you are specifically going to the select few institutions that have a program that counts for your grad degree and that is about Blackness and mental health. Like, nowhere teaches Afrocentricity. Now, part of that is because OG Afrocentricity suffers from a lot of colonialist theory. It's very homophobic and queerphobic. And this goes back to what I'm going to get into in a minute with the utilization of our strengths to disconnect us from them. But into psychotherapy is an Afrocentric psychotherapy, and its whole premise, and it works really well with NARM, because the whole premise is that the therapist is a guide, and that mental health is not just mental, it is also a spiritual endeavor. And a therapist, in order to be effective, must have done their own work, at least enough to be a model of sorts of how to be authentic in a world that punishes authenticity of Black people.
Yeah.
So I like that NARM borrows from these things and talks about things as far as not trying to distance from conflict, not trying to squelch out any discomfort, but the ability to sit with and be still and to respond instead of simply reacting. So when we talk about mental health and wellness and NARM, when it comes to the Black community, that's something that I want to keep working on, is making it explicit. Bringing that in and explicitly saying, like, okay, so cultural misattunement's a huge thing. Internalized, like, white saviorness is, social workers is built into the field. And that is something that we have to deal with and we have to talk about, because otherwise, not only are we as therapists, whether you're white, whether you're Black, whether you're Latinx, whether you're Indigenous, South Asian, whatever, like, there's a lot to be said about the way colonialism rewards disconnection from one's history.
Mm-hmm. Well, talk about white people. We don't have a culture, most of us, right?
I'm gonna disagree.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about culture in terms of, like, I'm German. Do I know anything about my Germanness? No.
I know.
Literally not a thing. But I know where you're going, and take it. Take it, man.
Whiteness is a culture on itself.
Yeah.
And we don't acknowledge that means that we don't talk about it. And that means that when white people are in a therapy room with white people, like, I saw an article and a post about the fact that like white people don't talk about whiteness in therapy. And I was like, wait, what?
What are y'all doing in there?
You mean I'm doing,
Right.
this is another place I'm doing double work? Because I talk about whiteness with my clients. I had one experience where I was encouraged to not tell a client that the reason I was terminating them was because they called me the help and that that was inappropriate.
I'm sorry that happened to you.
Yeah. I had a client who was talking about possibly wanting a different therapist and said that she would, was thinking that she'd want a referral to another therapist, even though I've been basically great. She kept calling me a great help, saying that I was a good helper. But anytime she started talking about a white clinician, it was about being a good therapist.
God.
And this was somebody who would cancel on me a lot and would get mad would late cancel or no show a lot, and then would get mad that that there were repercussions.
The fee. Right.
And so like that's whiteness. That entitlement, that the way you're showing up in the room, that's part of white culture. That's part of whiteness as a white woman showing up in a room with a black queer person. So whiteness absolutely has a culture, but the problem is the culture of whiteness is built on creating coalition to oppress, and thus also disconnects white people from their heritage. And so that's part of how we're all getting screwed here. Like we're all being thrown into this white supremacist capitalistic net and reeled in. And I like to talk to people about, and NARM helped me with this, about the fact that like our society is an abusive family system. And
yes,
the parents are the government, and different parts of those parental figures are different kinds of abusers or enablers. And then you have the scapegoat, which changes every now and then, but in America is pretty steadily Black people that get it the worst. And then you have the rest of the kids who are trying not to get it as bad and have various levels of, okay, I'm going to get in on this, because if I'm in on this, then maybe I won't get it. And then maybe I'm not the bad one doing something bad. And NARM talks about all of this, right? As connection and survival styles, connection and trust, and all of these things about attachment and attunement that really expands out. And so I want to bring this back into kind of the tighter lens here of being Black in the diaspora and having identity forcibly taken and adamantly forbidden for centuries, because NARM in my work has been an amazing tool, one of the most powerful tools that I have found to help my Black clients heal themselves. Because it's not about, well, you're doing something wrong, so let's fix it, the way that I'm pretty critical of the pervasiveness of behavioral therapies, because they're
right. Yes,
they have their uses. I'm trained in DBT, I'm trained in CBT, I have a bit of ACT training. Like, I use these things, but they are by and large not what many of their founders had anticipated them to be, and have definitely been wrung down. Like, DBT is supposed to be a full team model. People doing DBT aren't doing DBT, they are DBT informed. Because to be a true DBT facility, you need a community. And we don't do community so well.
right.
In America.
Can I also just note in here too, like the levels of care? One of the things we talk about in our trainings a lot is that as individual therapists, the pressure that is put on us by the system not supporting our clients who are somewhere in between a higher level of care and outpatient. There is nothing for those people.
Yeah, no, you either suck it up, buttercup, or you tank. And that in itself is a mind melt. We'll say it that way.
Great way to say it.
is a mind melt of its own. And so then when we're talking about the fact that like Black people are coming in for mental health now, they're looking, they're trying to find us. But then it goes back to your question about like white therapists keep having this conversation about like, okay, how do we show up in the room? How do we show up in the room? It's like, okay, well, first of all, do you have a Black colleague? Do you need to be in that room? Is that actually the client for you? Is a question that I think we also move away from it. But the power of seeing, and one of my clients today just said it, like the power of seeing somebody like them, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's, all my clients know I'm queer in some way. They don't know exactly how. They know I use they, them pronouns, but they don't fully know, but they know that there's some familiarity there. And the ability to have that is in itself healing when you can see somebody like you who has done some of their healing already sit in front of you and say, you got this. And those things you don't like about yourself, they're there because you're here and they worked.
Right. Yep.
And that's something that we really need to talk about, is the way that the queer community does talk about, like, it's not just enough to be a friend to a gay person, to be a therapist. Like, there's a difference between, you know, seeing gay people and being trained in that and being trained in gender and seeing trans folks. Like, these are different. The same way that we really need to be honest about...
You need a training with all the letters, not just, you're not just LGBTQIA plus trained. You have to get training in each of the letters.
Yeah. And like, granted, I have done that. And also, it's a journey, and I continue to read books and educate. And we need to be that honest when it comes to, as more people are looking to heal, like, how much humility are you willing to have? Like, I don't think that we should continue to cap it. Okay, yes, racism exists and I'm working to be anti-racist. Like, sometimes being anti-racist means admitting, like, actually, you know what? You're talking about identity. You're talking about feeling disconnected from what it means to be Black. I think it would really benefit you to have a Black therapist, and I have someone on speed dial for you, and they are taking people and doing a...
That's the hard part.
Yeah, and doing a warm handoff. Now, granted, that's not always possible, especially like we have the luxury of being in Chicago and having a bunch of people around for those purposes. And even then, sometimes, like, we full. There's not a lot of us. I'm not taking people right now. Like, and that's not because I don't want to, that's because I'm overloaded.
Right.
But going back to the spiritualness of spiritual as not religious, but as a connection to the idea that there's more than just you. That connection to the idea of more than just you for a really long time for Black people has meant slaves. We're slaves. There's slaves. There's more slaves, and then there's MLK, and then we ended racism.
Right. I think I saw that meme on Facebook.
Woo. Slaves, more slaves, MLK, and then we got Obama, and now racism's over.
Right.
Nobody pay any attention to the strange fruit in all the trees the last 2 weeks.
Right.
And that in itself is wounding. Like, I feel like every Black person in America is born with a gun to their head. And it says, conform or die. And conforming means, don't wear your natural hair. Why would you do that? Don't use those styles that your people originated and everybody wants to steal, because then you'll look ghetto. You'll look too ethnic. You won't get a job. I mean, I'm in some therapists of color and like Black therapists groups. And there are still to this day people telling folks who are starting their businesses to go get a relaxer for their professional photos, because if they don't, they won't get jobs. That's still happening. That is rooted in the way back. That comes from white women being jealous of the intricate, beautiful hair that slave women would do and the forced hair covering.
Right.
And things. And that hurts internally. I'm still on my hair journey. I'm still looking for a place to belong.
I'm here for those rainbow braids whenever you bring them, though.
Once getting them doesn't mean possibly getting a plague.
Yeah.
I'll go sit for another like 7 hours and get my braids back. But right now, that's a wound. Not like when we talk about intergenerational wounding, we're not just talking about traumas. We're talking about spirit. We're talking about coming down the pike, mind, body, and soul, higher blood sugar, higher blood pressure, PTSD-like symptoms from birth kind of wounding that only happens when you talk about these things like ori, which is the head in Yoruba, like that idea that a piece of you has been with you for ages and knows, but the ways that we've been disconnected from that spiritual head as people. And that doesn't require you to follow any religion. That only requires you to look around and be like, yeah, they sure did split up Black families when they brought them over.
Yeah.
Yeah, we sure are still splitting up Black families right now.
Right. Jail and the foster care system, right?
Yep. And the new way that the same things keep happening mean that to be effective, I think that these things need to be part of curriculum. They need to be taught in NARM, because the people who need this most, I know when Gui mentioned this, like the people who need this most are the Black people, are the Indigenous people, are the people who, by and large, those providers are frequently not in a place to afford these trainings. So then how do we also meet that need? How do we get this to a place where, because we're all obsessed with research informed practice, I say informed, not based, because the research has overwhelming gaps, and the race for funding has significant barriers to doing things like longitudinal studies. What happens after those 12 CBT sessions? What
exactly
actually does that do? And the fact that there's racist roots in many of the therapies we're using is also something to contend with, because without having anti-oppressive, anti-racist roots in anything we're using, we really could be doing harm to people. And I like the fact that Brad has been so open to hearing me out and not shutting me down when in the middle of a session I'm like, this sounds really suspect. How does this apply to people for whom trauma doesn't stop?
Exactly. Well, that's actually one question I wanted to make sure we get to before we end here is, one of the things that you brought up and I was thinking, and I know a lot of other people were thinking in the training, is that like, okay, agency is an individual thing. And what do we do when the trauma doesn't stop? So what have you found in your own journey or in work with clients as it applies to those concepts?
What I've really found is that like post-traumatic growth is, I'm coming to believe that it in itself is a limiting concept, a limiting and privileged concept, because we haven't stopped growing.
Right.
Despite the trauma, despite the constant and consistent, murders on TV, the jobs that like Black people enough to hire them for the call center but don't want to make anybody a manager. All of these things are trauma, and they're constant and they're daily, and yet we're still growing. I'm opening a business. That's growth. I'm healing myself as we speak. That's growth. And so I think that if we get rid of that post-traumatic piece and we just talk about growth, how do we grow? And we bring in these concepts of interconnectedness, and we bring in these concepts of authenticity, not as like, okay, cool, I'm wearing the latest designer that I like, which authenticity, that can be a piece, but really what we're talking about authenticity is the ability to know thyself.
Yes.
To be able to be and know internally what you do and don't want, and then react in a way that you feel good about, even in situations that aren't good. I was talking to a client this morning about the fact that healing doesn't mean that the world suddenly got better. Healing means that you've learned how you want to relate to that world. And bringing in those concepts to say, and this is something that I have struggled with learning NARM, is I keep being like, but it's not stopping. Like, but it feels bad. But like, I'm going to get punished for it. And I figured out for myself that is not about things being better. It's not about not feeling discomfort. It's about knowing that that discomfort is still getting you towards what you want and being okay about it. It's about knowing that, like, yeah, if I want to wear my rainbow braids and be bright and colorful and loud and angry, that is authentically me and my experience, and that I'm not hurting anyone. And the reason it hurts for me is because, unfortunately, I live in a place, in a society where my authenticity is a threat to the status quo.
It's not really a threat, but it's perceived as a threat.
Oh, but it's absolutely a threat, though, right? If we were all able to heal ourselves, acknowledge our authenticity and our interconnectedness and our energy, and be alive, we wouldn't be working for half of these companies. We wouldn't be allowing all or nothing politics. We wouldn't be allowing the destruction of our earth. There may be some people who, like, wholeheartedly, I'm going to get this wrong and my friend's going to kill me, but I think it's their dharma. They're purposefully aligned to, like, steal stuff or whatever, but, like, and that's what they've chosen or what, but, like, there might be some people who legitimately, chaotic evil is where they're at, because I'm going to go to nerd references here. But by and large, that's not where we're going to be. That apathy, like, I think one thing about everything that's happening right now is part of the reason it's happening is because we've been at home for 3 months, sitting with ourselves, finally, for the first time in a century. And people are forced to feel some connection to a Black man, to a Black trans man, to a Black woman who was asleep. Breonna Taylor's murderers still haven't been arrested, y'all. And that in itself shows that outrage, the fact that every state in the country, that multiple countries in the world felt that.
Right.
Because we're interconnected, and we wouldn't stand for this if we weren't exhausted and hating ourselves and disconnected from our energy, whatever you want to call it, whether it's ashe, whether it's energy, whether it's spirit, whether it's heart, whatever that is, we wouldn't be doing this.
Right. Yeah. Well, that feels like a good place to close, even though there's so much more we could talk about. We'll have to have you back. Yes. Once you get your practice all up and running, we'll have you back. But I so appreciate you. I appreciate learning with you, from you, and being in connection with you. And yeah, there's a lot of amazing nuggets in here. And I really hope listeners are really chewing on all that you've shared with us today.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Cassie. I just appreciate you as a human.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you too.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can check out the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Please join us for our online NARM training in learning how to transform trauma. This online NARM basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit at www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.